I've seen the sentiment shared that Golden Sun and its sequel The Lost Age are one in the same, or that the second is an extension of the first and should be treated as such, but outside of the narrative ties, I don't think that's fair to either game. The second title does improve certain things, but it fundamentally misses the point of continuing the same story from another perspective. While some attempts were made at kicking a bit of life into a fairly standard JRPG, it struggles to make up for the things it compromises on. As a conclusion to the story, it felt rushed. There's plenty of narrative cop-outs, heavily understated moments, and a general lack of focus, which left me disappointed. But it's not all bad. I want to tread lightly with this video, especially with the harsh contrast to my coverage of the first game, which was overwhelmingly positive. It's because of this that I've decided to split the video into 4 major sections. These will be the introduction, story and characterization, combat, and world and puzzle design. I've got a lot to say, and the thought of it not being structured is quite frankly frightening. The beginning of each section will be timestamped in the description, and I hope you follow along closely to fact check. Upon starting a new game, you're given the option to input a password. There are 3 tiers to this, and each varies in length and impact. The highest tier imports items, gin, character levels, and dictates a bunch of optional events influenced by actions taken in the previous game. I didn't want to miss anything, so I went top tier, which is over 200 characters long, and the chunky bastard took about 12 minutes to input. Even though it was a bit of a pain, the password system was a necessary inclusion. With the original crew eventually tagging along on our new journey, being able to access those spoils from the previous adventure not only creates a personalised playthrough, but retroactively rewards the effort dumped into the first title. The Lost Age picks up before the final battle in the original game, when I'm Sick and the Funky Bunch are fighting the Fusion Dragon. However, this time we focus on Felix and Jenna doing whatever they were doing. Shifting the perspective can be a neat idea, but I'll get more into this later. Initially, it's used as a fake-out, as you're immediately given control of Jenna and not our long-haired hero-to-be. But before you let loose in the world, you're forced to watch some dialogue with, Kraden, and then Felix casts a cheeky synergy before he practices his diving form off the crumbling tower. This scene serves as a refresher for returning players, while also acting as a demonstration for those who started with the second game. Given that Synergy is such a distinct action, you're going to take notice of a giant floating mind hand if you're unfamiliar, and it stands tall as a micro-tutorial. Yeah! Jenna, Alex, and Kraden descend the tower and have a little tussle with a mob, which brings Alex's motivations into question. Seeing as he doesn't kill the overly hostile villagers and also doesn't care about keeping the supposedly kidnapped victims close, it emboldens his mysterious persona. During this, we're walked through a handful of tutorial battles and arrive at the point of no return, both in a narrative and a quality sense. I like the intro up until this point. So far we've got a new perspective, a vague motivation, and the nature of our only remaining antagonist, Alex, is up in the air. Then the Venus Lighthouse splits, triggering an earthquake. This is where the Lost Age truly begins, and where it all starts to go downhill. During the earthquake, a modest amount of land splits from the main continent and is set adrift. Jenna, Kraden, and Alex just so happen to be on this newly formed island waiting for the return of Saturos and Minardi. They're gonna be waiting a while. The landmass ostensibly drifts for a decent amount of time, which is alluded to as the party takes a little power nap and Special K mentions that he's hungry. Then, Felix and Sheba wash up on the island, despite the fact that it's in the middle of the ocean, and they fell off a tower nowhere near the middle of the ocean. Also, neither of them died from the impact of the blast, the fall, nor did they drown. There's a nice little reunion, everyone's having a good old time, and then a tidal wave appears and utterly obliterates the island, killing everyone. It would have been for the better. What actually happens is that nobody dies or becomes displaced except for Alex. What's more, not only is the party alive, but they're now safely docked on land as the island was pushed in the general direction they were heading.
No, coincidence.
This entire section is beyond unnecessary. I get that the second game needed to make a clean break from the first, and what better way than a tectonic catastrophe, however it detracts from the opening scene because it's so long-winded. In the original game, you've got a simple premise, a focused sequence of events which set in place an urgent goal, and you're immediately thrust into action. The advantage to a sequel is that your premise and setting are already established, so little time need be wasted in order to catch up. The Lost Age drags you through a wall of ultimately meaningless and swiftly forgotten events which serve little purpose outside of putting the key players at the required point. It's almost like that's a recurring theme. After this happened, I sat there in disbelief, genuinely questioning if what I just saw was real or not. Like, first you subject me to Kraden, and now this? It's fucking bullshit. Kraden is now a part of the caravan and makes his presence known by co-opting every single conversation in the game and making it about Synergy. Dude's like a Scientologist. Old Mate even forcefully inserts himself into tutorials without a shred of consent. Early on, there's a bush which needs to be blown away with the whirlwind Synergy. The original Golden Sun featured a moment like this, which was initially impassable and had a snappy little introduction for Ivan. Not only did this demonstrate how his Synergy worked, it also laid out the ways in which it could be used synergistically, and that puzzles, and by extension progress, could demand multiple interactions. It was memorable, it was effective, and it was one of the few scenes where Ivan was tolerable. Kraden, on the other hand, just tells you what to do, and it's lazy garbage. He is demonstrably worse than Ivan, and that's the most extreme, hateful thing I've ever said. He's overly prominent and doesn't have a single redeeming moment in the entire game. It should have been called Golden Sun, Kraden's bizarre text adventure. Golden Sun, I wish the aged would get lost. You better be dead in Dark Dawn, you fuck. The introduction ends as we arrive at the first town and are given the modest goal of finding a boat. As I mentioned in the previous section, the primary motivation for the first chunk of the game is to find a boat and sail to Lemuria. If you recall, Lemuria is the place in which Barbie, the leader of Tolby, a notorious invisible man, liberated an elixir which grants immortality. As the party arrives in these fabled lands, they discover a secluded people whose technology and understanding is so advanced they've stopped feeling emotions and have heavily delayed the aging process. Their leader, Ben Shapiro, informs us of a world on the brink of destruction, where the mystical energies of the land have dwindled, and as a result, the edges are ever encroaching. He theorizes that the only way to prevent Wayard from vanishing entirely is to restore power to the lighthouses and bring Synergy back to the world, which Kraden backs up because he's a conversational leech.
Oh, you think you're so high and mighty because you have a high IQ.
Yeah.
This is a brilliant twist. It takes everything you set out to accomplish in the previous game and flips it on its head, turning the supposed heroes of Wayard into the ignorant and unwilling antagonists. Lemuria itself has a bunch of xenophobic rules and a senate where a band of old fogies talk about how to save the world within the confines of those rules, but never set out to achieve anything. The leader of the senate, Conservato, yeah, subtlety's an art form, tells the party that if they attempt to light the beacons, they go on the shit list and won't be forgiven. But nothing ever comes of it. At least they did a good job writing the politicians. This is another recurring theme in The Lost Age, where there's a stolen shipload of dialogue which unnecessarily overexposes, but then it's never brought up again. A great example of this is in a town with a werewolf who can use Synergy, and who apparently got his powers because shards of a Synergy stone caught the wind and landed in town. What? Then there's a little dialogue about how exposure to these stones can create adepts, and apparently furries, but it's never brought up again. The dialogue isn't the only offender of the all bark no bite mentality, as the follow-on events from Golden Sun are one-off encounters that simply don't make sense. The two major ones are the sly thieves from Vault and some meathead warriors from Colosso. These only occur because of the party's association to Ezok, then you're forced into an easy battle because of this guilt by association bullshit, which nets you a free item. That's the full extent of these events, and while it's neat that there are scenarios which span multiple games, they have nothing to do with Felix's party. He's simply roped into them because he's the stand-in for the real protagonist, which is of course, Kraden. Unfortunately, this is also reflective of the actual villains, who don't really care about Felix until they realise he's a friend of Isaac. They also don't become hostile until much later in the game, so they don't function as a consistent negative motivator like Saturos and Minardi did. We're meant to see the party from the first game as the antagonists, as even though it's not coming from a place of malice, if they succeed with their goals, the world ends. This doesn't work though, because of how the Lost Age plays out. The OG crew have no way of knowing that Felix and his groupies got blown off course, so their immediate destination is the third lighthouse. The fact that you piss fart around for 20 odd hours before you get there means that Isaac's irrelevant until that point, and the biggest hurdle you face is water. And a rock. I think this was a missed opportunity and led to a lack of adversity. Imagine for a moment that instead of Isaac going straight for the objective, he hounded Felix and attempted to halt his progress. Then, instead of a bunch of NPCs telling you about Isaac's movement, you'd see it for yourself. Who knows where he'd pop up and what dastardly deeds he'd attempt. For this to work, Isaac's character would need a short-term shift. We know that he was personally tasked by the Great One to protect the world, so turning him into a borderline zealot would justify that aggressive pursuit. He also kinda snaps at the end of the first game, and it's clear that his entrenched resolve would see him kill his long-haired friend with little hesitation. I mean shit, it's probably not the best idea, but you could give the dude a moustache to twirl and he'd be better than anything in the Lost Age. Because he'd exist. The primary bad boys are Casp and Agatio, and they're not very good. The traditionally male and female pair fill the shoes of Saturos and Minardi as they come from the same town, have the same goals, and both couples hate Isaac. This new antagonistic duo have a slightly better justification, however, as Casp is Minardi's sister. Since Isaac fought Minardi over false information, he has effectively killed someone who did nothing wrong. Not an innocent person by any means, but far from an evil person. I mean, she was indirectly trying to save the world. Ah shit, I'm talking about Isaac again. This is supposed to be Felix's adventure. Casp and Agatio pop up a few times throughout the story and act playfully hostile toward Felix, with Alex playing the role of moderator, or daddy if you're into that. Fundamentally, they share the same goal, so as long as Isaac's out of the picture, they're not really antagonists. Felix does name drop the so-called chosen hero, which sets Casp off, but the only thing that the deadly duo can fault our protagonist on is his association to the past protagonist. It seems like the developers still needed Saturos and Minardi, but also needed a climax for the first game, and they were the only characters that could be disposed of. Replacing them with borderline clones completely undermines their deaths, which should have a reflective sorrow to it, as it was ultimately unnecessary. Nah, fuck that, bring in Scrappy-Doo. Alex was the logical choice for the primary antagonist after Isaac and co come to their senses, but he got completely shafted. He's non-hostile to the point where I thought he was going to do a cheeky flip and become a last-minute good guy. Unfortunately, his motivations outside of activating the lighthouse were kept vague until the end credits, and then, in an act of absolute underwhelming plot hole patching, he gets crushed by the Wise One. Then the game ends. It's like they forgot he existed, which makes the narrative come across as rushed because there's no antagonist during the first half of the game, despite there being a completely underutilized candidate. Maybe this came down to development constraints or something where they had a plan but simply lacked the time to implement it, so they just gave him a poorly thought out, underwhelming end. I have no doubt we'll see him in Dark Dawn though, because an anime character never dies off screen. Except for Barbie. Rip Barbie. So the story's absent of major conflict for let's say 70% of the game, then the original party rock up and open the floodgates. Arriving at the third lighthouse before Felix's crew, they encounter not Minardi and... what was his? I don't fucking remember. Anyway, Isaac's crew gets caught in a trap by the antagonists and are about to be killed. With Mia and Garrett out of the picture, only Isaac and shit-cunt Ivan remain. Given that Ivan is Ivan, he gets his pussy pounded, and apparently Isaac caught a severe case of retard due to long-term exposure to the soy-filled manlet, because he gets his bum slapped too. So he can beat Saturos and Minardi, both as humanoids and as a giant twin-headed dragon, but he can't even stand up to these people who, as it's been established, are weaker than their predecessors. Okay. So the F crew rock up and F the antagonist with a little help from their friend Alex, again contributing to his strange motivations. But then the bad boys go full-blown villain and flee to the next lighthouse to do the exact same thing Felix will do when he gets there. It's really dumb. Apparently petty revenge means more to these brainlets than saving the world. I get why you'd want Isaac dead. I mean, he hangs out with Ivan and Creighton all day, that's perfectly valid, but couldn't that wait until after your village is free from the threat of the world dissolving? Like, Minardi's already dead, but the people in your town are still alive. You'd think they'd prioritize survivability, but they don't have internal consistency because they're bad antagonists. Playing as Felix up until this point gave you a behind-the-scenes look at the events taking place, which is a fantastic idea, but they did nothing with it. All you really do during your time with Felix is busy work. You trick some natives, fetch quest a sea god to death, get a boat and chase a pirate, which all sounds rad, but it's not. To be fair, I think it was necessary for the player to not be in control of Isaac when the plot twist was dropped. The reveal had to linger for a bit and not be undermined by immediate gratification. However, more had to be done to justify the perspective switch, because the Lost Age is still his story, we just see very little of it. If I had to pick a theme to assign to the original game, I would say it's failure. If you look at all the major story beats, it's a consistent string of missteps and defeat. Isaac fails to protect the town, to stop Saturos and Minardi, to free Janet and Creighton, to save Felix, Sheba and Barbie, and even though he ultimately strikes down his foes, he fails to prevent the activation of 2 of the lighthouses. If that ain't failure, I'm a fucking doctor.
Sorry I'm late, folks. I had more important things to take care of. I'm actually a doctor. She's a doctor, folks. His wife's a doctor, folks. She's a doctor, My wife's a doctor.
In a harsh contrast to this, Felix constantly succeeds and immediately gets what he wants. His only major struggle is finding a boat, and you don't have to wait too long for that. Felix and his party aren't the underdog, they're top dog. They've got shit under control and face very little challenge when it comes to achieving their goals. Time isn't necessarily against them, and they don't have a major opposing force. Every time you fail in Golden Sun, it makes you want to do better. It enforces that drive of wanting to defeat your enemies and save the world, even if that's what we're actively working against. The Lost Age features nothing even remotely close, and largely consists of a string of unrelated events that seem more like a list of chores than meaningful progression. Since it's not Felix's story, it was heavily padded until the real events kick off as Isaac joins the party. In a desperate attempt to justify the perspective shift, upon joining, Isaac tells Felix that this is his journey now, which begs the question, what the fuck was it up until this point? This not only cements my criticism, but it's also bullshit as it continues to be Isaac's story. Turns out that he's the chosen one, and every event that occurred was simply a test designed solely for him. Killing Saturos and Minardi, their Lost Age counterparts Casp and Agatio, and almost killing Felix was just some sick game to test Isaac's purity, despite the fact that he owns several purity rings. Wait, shit. Despite the fact that Saturos and Minardi not only saved some of the villagers from Vale, but their goal was to save the world, and to stop Isaac from stopping them from saving the world. The cherry on top is that the Wise One explicitly states that he cannot directly interfere with the course of events, and that it's up to those within to decide their own fate, yet he does so multiple times. He then turns Isaac's father, as well as the parents of Jenna and Felix, into a giant dragon, and the party's forced to kill their own parents. After some brief mourning, he reveals that it was just a prank bro and magics them back to life, because he can't interfere with it doesn't matter. Then, Alex's poorly detailed plan to obtain the ultimate power gets slapped down, and he gets buried under Mount Aleph. Roll credits, cue happy ending where everyone's alive except for the bad guys who weren't really bad guys. Also, Isaac's not just the chosen one, he's extra chosen and has a part of the Golden Sun in him. Sorry, I didn't realize I was playing Kingdom Hearts. Maybe this comes up in Dark Dawn, but as it stands at the end of the second game, it's really fucking dumb. The story is garbage, but unlike the first game, the little moments don't carry it because they're all fucking fetch quests that don't amount to anything, but I'll get to that. Overall, the game was poorly paced and unfocused, and with 9 characters in the party toward the end of the game, they were all struggling for screen time with massive dialogue dumps headed by fuckface Kraden. God, I want to fight Kraden. I don't have much to say about the combat as it hasn't really changed, but there are a few small things I want to touch upon. For starters, the difficulty's a bit all over the place. Random encounters are little more than experience fodder, which I can't really fault it for because, you know, it's a turn-based JRPG. But in a harsh contrast to the previous installment, some of the bosses are actually challenging, engaging fights, in that I lost more characters than just Ivan. Fucking hate that kid. Much like its forefather Beyond the Beyond, the story bosses were few and far between, but when they did rock up, they served their purpose. The Lost Age has a slightly larger focus on endgame content than the last title, and this is where encounters really shine. While there are only 4 optional bosses, 3 of them are fantastic, and the Star Magician stands tall as the best fight in the whole series. So far. He enters the battle with 4 orbs, one representing each element. They have a low health value but a high respawn rate and can be a threat if they're left for too long. As these orbs respawn, they take on a random element, and each corresponds to its own set of attacks, so you could end up staring down 3 healing orbs and 1 shielding orb, rendering attacks effectively useless. Instead of a standard stacked boss fight where it's your crew versus 1 bloke, it plays like 2 parties fighting it out. Star Magician's tendency to change strats on the fly makes it more about resource management, where you very slowly and methodically trickle his HP down while adjusting your movesets. There's also value in tanking some extra hits from damage orbs to prevent healing orbs popping up in their place, which can be risky but demonstrates why this fight is the best. I love it. There were 2 bosses that I didn't like, however, and this may surprise you, but they were the final boss Doom Dragon and Dullahan, the ultimate super duper secret boss. My major gripe with them was that they have a move called Djinn Storm, which puts all your Djinn into cooldown, removing the stat boost you gain from having them equipped and disallowing their use for a few turns. It seems counterintuitive to build the entire combat system around these creatures, only to introduce a technique that renders them all redundant and which can effortlessly be fired off by powerful foes which you actually need the Djinn against. Given that these enemies can also act multiple times per turn, you can easily see your party swept or put in a critical condition in a single move, and all your party builds and techniques are drastically changed. I don't know, it just seems cheap. Like, here, have this cool power. Ah, just kidding, fuck you. The only surefire methods I found to avoid this heavy penalty were either to grind excessively to make up for the stats you lose, or to cheese the bosses. There's nothing like a good old gin rush to slap a health bar down as the battle begins. If the game's gonna restrict them anyway, you might as well spam summons up front and try to glass cannon your foe before your measly health hits 0. A lot of people see this as cheap, which is fair because it is, but I used it to beat Dullahan, so bow to the king of cheese. Good old Dullahan also acts in a consistent rotating pattern, so you can utilise abilities to make him skip the turns he uses Gin Storm on. This method is equally as cheesy as the former, and quite frankly, I think it speaks to the poor design of the technique, and as an extension, the bosses that use it. While we're on the subject of Jin and their usefulness, I played around with the class system a bit more this time because the game practically begged me to. You're given these class change items, which when equipped grant you a new class with unique synergy, and I never found them particularly helpful, especially with the modest inventory limit, but they were cool to fuck with. You're also delivered a hefty amount of Mercury Jin before Piers joins the party, so you're heavily encouraged to screw with class combinations from quite early on. I found that most of my Jin mixing was done in the early to mid game and in certain puzzle sections, but I still largely stuck with the elementally pure route. Combat's already easy enough, and speccing for stats to make bosses more trivial works much better in games with a higher level of difficulty. I don't know, none of it matters when you get Jin Stormed anyway, so whatever. It's rad that you can mess around with different distributions for stat and ability tweaking, but it's equally rad that it's entirely optional. The largest change to the combat system is the addition of a second party and the ability to switch formation during battle. Your active party can consist of any combination of 4 characters of the 8 on offer, and if one group is swept during a tussle, the second will stand firm in their place. You can also switch out one character per turn if you want to keep a healthy rotation or need another character for whatever reason. This is a great way of keeping both parties active and viable. JRPGs have a tendency to see an excessive roster go to waste, either due to a restricted party size or to an unnecessarily bloated method of swapping them out. And I quite like the system in Golden Sun 2, but it becomes a bit of an issue as you're effectively given a burner party. I personally didn't use anyone from Isaac's crew because by the time I reached them, my main crew was almost 10 levels higher and the gear disparity was insane. However, if I struggled with a boss, like say Dullahan for example, I'd load those fuckers up and use them for a throwaway Jin rush before I instituted my core party for the final stretch. And I know that this is more of a gripe about the general concept of cheese, but this isn't a food review.
Same as it ever was.
What irks me about this system is the flat party swap that occurs when one lineup is completely wiped. I don't think it's implemented well, and it would have been better if players were required to individually swap dead characters out, requiring 4 entire turns to switch to the off party. This would have made Jin rushing extremely risky, as 4 dead characters would see a game over instead of a party swap, and would heavily disincentivize the cheese. Now you might be thinking, well that's stupid, why would 4 party members give up when seeing their friends defeated? I mean, it's no more stupid than watching 4 friends fight giant monsters while you just stand there doing nothing. Realism sucks, and this could have been a system built around a risk-reward dynamic, raising the challenge of tough boss encounters even further. It would have been a great refinement of the combat found in the first game, and a flat removal of Jin Storm would make it that much better.
I have crippling depression.
There were a few other attempts at building upon the combat, such as the dual element summons. These were a neat addition, although I didn't use them much, as most do less damage than those of the pure element. The few that are actually useful are only obtainable after beating the hardest enemies in the game, at which point you've got no one left to use them on. I guess you could use them against the final boss, but if you can already trash Dullahan, it seems like overkill to me. And honestly, I found that most of my battles were dictated by weapons with an unleash effect, as they seemed to be far more powerful than most spells and were even comparable to summon damage. Despite their chance-based nature, it's a rad way to justify using regular attacks against stronger enemies, especially when they do activate, and you get a nice little effect as you cleave them a new asshole. Ah, rippin' assholes. That takes me back. Nani? Okay, time for the final section. Bring your buckets, cause it's gonna get wet. The first Golden Sun played it pretty safe when it came to visual theming, with a conventional JRPG take on a medieval European setting. There was a bit of spice in there too, with the Chinese-inspired areas, the town with trees for houses, and Rome. It took me a while to notice the parallels to the real world, but Tolby, or Golden Sun's take on Rome, features a Colosseum, vaguely Roman architecture, and gladiators littered everywhere. Since the first game is relatively small and enclosed, it's not as apparent, however the second game is quite blatant. It all clicked when I got down to the Oceania content and saw a desert shaped roughly like Australia, with a wind-based dungeon smack bang in the middle titled Ayers Rock. Cheeky buggers. There's not much to say about this, I just think it's cool, and it's funny as fuck that the stand-in for North America is full of Indians in teepees. They have no idea what's coming. Weyard is quite the varied place, and the Lost Age allowing a more thorough interaction with it was a welcome addition. I adore the modest, almost confined scope of the original game, but the expansion is much appreciated, as that's what I think a sequel is best suited to. The terrain borrows far less from JRPG conventions and substitutes them for the more simple locales you'd find in third world regions. Plenty of remote villages, tropical climates, and a general sense of isolation as each area is distinct and has its own culture. The various civilizations seem significantly older, with their temples, monuments, and giant god statue things. Some towns are entirely stone constructs, while others are mud huts, and that kind of variety gives you the sense that the different areas of the world progress at different rates, and that each interaction will be unique and meaningful. And that's not too far off, they're certainly unique. Then you've got places like Lemuria, which are so advanced and enlightened due to their longevity that they're down with incest. Nice. Amid your world map exploration, you can see the continent in which the first game was set, but are unable to access it. I don't mind this because as far as I'm concerned, we're done with that area, but this landmass existing solely for the sake of world consistency is a nice little inclusion. It would have been rad if you could go back to select places for optional events, but I get why they didn't because barely any time has passed between the two games, so it'd be more or less the same. As the party sails the seas of Fetch, you'll notice water flowing into nothingness, which is a neat way of clearly defining the edges of the world, and it's so much more interesting than a never-ending mountain range or a looping map. It also does a great job of driving home the urgency of your task, as you can physically see the world receding. While the environments are a welcome shift and keep the game visually interesting, the events contained within do not respect your time. Traversal is made extremely tedious by the mandatory backtracking, general lack of direction, and high encounter rate. It doesn't lighten up once you get the ship either, as random encounters occur on the waves. Yep, I'm gonna have to give this a 78%, it's too moist. My cheeky solution for this was to have the battle repellent synergy fixed to one of the shortcut buttons and spammed regularly so I could actually get shit done. You're not granted a quick travel ability until the final dungeon, which is ridiculous and heavily disincentivizes optional backtracking amid the obligatory variety. When you get the flying ship, you can soar over certain obstacles and aren't subject to random encounters, making traversal a much quicker affair. However, it's given just before the player requires teleport, which should have been given earlier to make the back and forth less cumbersome. The game even tries to reward the player with backtracking, and while it's a fantastic idea to reuse areas for optional rewards, it'd be much better if the mandatory retread weren't so prevalent. For example, there's an area where you fight a serpent dragon at the end of a decently girthy dungeon. Upon finishing up, you're teleported to a different area and told that there's a treasure hidden all the way back in the boss room, so you gotta go back and get it. This happens a few more times, such as in the Gobomba statue, where you have to backtrack for a djinn and a bit of optional story, or in the Shrine of the Sea God, where you're forced to return later for a fetch quest. Plenty of story events are gated behind synergy found in dungeons that don't have a major narrative connection. Not only can most of this progression be boiled down to meaningless throwaway fetch quests, but it's an incredibly lazy way to gate the player, as most synergy are only used a handful of times, if that. It's not all bad though, as when Isaac and co join, they bring their own synergies from the first game, which you can use to explore more areas of the world. The legacy techniques are only used a couple times as well, but that makes sense as there was previously an entire game built around them, so they've already had their fair share. This was a spiffy addition, as most interactions with the synergy of old are for optional events, so you might stumble upon a liftable rock before you obtain lift, which encourages exploration and memorization of the world. The developers could have just as easily substituted these obstacles for magic gates that only disappear once you tick a certain flag, but they kept the core idea of designing the world around synergy, and that's fantastic. It ultimately achieves the same end, but this method cheekily puts the ball in the player's court and says, hey, it might be a good idea to do something with that ball. And while that's a great way to keep the player an active participant in your fictional world, it's unfortunately not reflective of the game at large. When it comes to the overall sequence of events, I'd say the point that soured me toward the entire experience was the road to Lemuria. It's a puzzle area where you're forced to do some cursory exploring to find the solution. In a random town, some kids do a little dance in this oddly specific pattern and give directions for replicating it precisely. I have a shit memory so I had to draw it, but it's pretty good, eh? The execution's a bit finicky even when you know the solution, but you're given an encounter-free area to tinker and test, so it's a non-issue. Where it does become an issue is right at the end of the movement sequence when you pit against Poseidon, who is unbeatable. To best this undying god, you need an item which consists of 3 smaller items, and each piece is found within its own dungeon. To get through 2 of these 3 dungeons, you need to clear out 2 other dungeons that feature the required synergy to progress through the dungeons with the trident pieces inside them. Then you've got to explode a rock on a ship from a much earlier area so a pirate can steal it and sail home, which allows you to speak with his grandmother, who will reforge the item. All of my complaints about the first game seem so minuscule in retrospect. So to get to Lemuria and progress the narrative, you need to complete 5 individual dungeons just to get an item to beat an immortal boss that only one NPC briefly mentions, to my knowledge. I don't know why the 3 items weren't swapped for a singular MacGuffin, because it's excessive and it's little more than unapologetic padding. Why couldn't the item be intact and those dungeons utilized for something greater than a bunch of fetching? I did an excessive amount of exploring and only found 2 of the prongs before I attempted to reach Lemuria, as I assumed they were for a weapon or an optional event later in the game. You're also constantly told to go straight to Lemuria because it's extremely important and that time is of the essence, so it'll naturally be one of the first places you go. Or attempt to, because you're gated by one of the stupidest sequences of events I've seen in a video game. I sincerely doubt that many people would have cleared the entire Trident quest before stumbling upon Poseidon because the sequence of events makes no fucking sense. Unless they either used a walkthrough or saw the event prior, I'd wager that most people got dunked on by old Posy. The clear intention was for you to get your ass ruined, so you know that there's more things to do outside of Lemuria and then you commence the fetch quest. I don't know, maybe there was a huge indicator that I missed, but I tried to be as thorough as possible. If I did miss something, please let me know in the comments, because this is awful. Assuming I didn't miss anything, there needed to be some better guidance regarding this part specifically, because one NPC mentioning Poseidon simply isn't enough to make the sequence of events not trash. A feature I genuinely appreciated about the first Golden Sun was that it was incredibly focused. Despite having a decent amount of optional content, it was all strung along a linear pursuit with a clear end goal. You were always chasing the antagonist, even if you stumbled upon a magic tree or a flooded town along the way. The Lost Age lacked that focus, and it was far too lenient with story urgency. It seemed like the front half of the game exists solely to catch Felix's party up to Isaac in terms of stats and equipment. I adore the mild deviation from strict linearity, but it comes at the expense of pacing, meaningful events, and a well-structured narrative, which isn't exclusive to Golden Sun by any means, but it impacts it far more than most games. Doing things out of the intended order is always nice, but again, I enjoyed it far more in the previous title because it was still heavily controlled. In The Lost Age, I did too many things out of the intended order, then I walked through a handful of dungeons where enemies couldn't hurt me at all. I just wanted to get Piers as soon as possible, and it made going back to dungeons like Ayers Rock a bland chore, despite the puzzles within being pretty solid. I would have liked to have seen each area scale up based on what events you'd completed prior, that way there would always be a consistent challenge regardless of what order you tackle them in. The fact that most dungeons end without a boss fight also doesn't help gauge whether you're appropriately leveled or not, as random encounters are not a good metric. I addressed the idea of boss-free dungeons in my Beyond the Beyond video, so I won't go in on this too much, but more bosses might have helped the game feel less samey and empty. They'd work as a stronger distinguishing factor than a sequence of puzzles and an item. I've been pretty harsh in this section, but there's a lot of good shit too, so let's end on a high note. The puzzles were made more complex in this game, and a lot of small details were added to existing mechanics to make some fantastic interactions. Overall, they weren't too challenging, but I struggled far more than in the previous title. That is to say, somewhat, and the punishment for making mistakes was heavier due to the finality of the design. They seem to be more segmented, consisting of smaller pieces to a larger puzzle, and were never too far from the load zone if they needed to be reset. Traversal also benefits from a larger integration of puzzle elements, and Taupo Swamp, easily one of my favourite parts of the game, is a great example of this. There's a muddy, swampy area where sections of it are visibly bubbling. Moving around the muck will see Felix rapidly sink to the bottom, which respawns him on land. The bubbling areas are safe to stand on and reset your height, allowing you to take your time to suss out your next movement. I love this section, not only because it makes you pause for a second before you move, implementing a finite step count to promote brain thinking, but the force constraints aren't obtuse, and they fit the map's theme perfectly. When you can make the player think about things that are generally mindless, such as movement, I think you've designed a good puzzle. Another great addition is the movable pillars from the original game. They've been enhanced, if you can believe that. Instead of solely being used to hop over gaps or as obstacles in larger puzzles, some have been affixed with vines, allowing them to be climbed. This means that maps with multiple elevations can be delivered in a more natural way, while also reducing unnecessary movement. The more arid sections of the world have a variant which begins to crumble when stepped on. This is not only a neat revision because it limits the amount of times a pillar can be used before it's destroyed, but it can also mask detail and obstruct paths. Outside of simply being a stepping stone, certain puzzles utilize these pillars differently and actually require you to destroy them to progress. Then there are depressible pillars, which look like a fallen stalactite has embedded itself in the ground. These can be hammered into the earth with the funniest synergy in the game, punching down. Much like the previous variant, they're good at masking detail and often require a reset if you mess up, which I don't mind so much as it allows for a more complex implementation. Another thing I loved was during certain sections where you'd go to capture a djinn and it'd turn into a mini movement puzzle. These circuits are often set up to loop and require some sort of blockage to grab the little bastards. What makes this great is that the djinn are bound to the same rules as Felix when it comes to movement, so that thing you fundamentally understand because it's the most basic mechanic in the game is coupled with synergy and turned into a puzzle. These puzzles aren't particularly deep, and this style of djinn capture's only used about 4 times, but it's bloody brilliant. It's so much better than just fighting them and hoping to fuck they don't flee. Another improvement found in the Lost Age is the dungeon design. Some of these fuckers are gigantic, yet they remain intricately designed and exist as a shining force for how puzzles and their pacing should be handled in JRPGs. Starting as a modest introduction to a single idea, they build and build while integrating other concepts until it's one giant mechanical clusterfuck which is surprisingly cohesive. The pinnacle of these areas is the elemental dungeons, existing as labyrinthian megastructures, with the exterior featuring heavily involved puzzles which grant you access to the inside, where the guts are packed with even more complexity. While these are thick beasts, they never overstayed their welcome, and I'd go as far as to say they're the best parts of the game. You could isolate these dungeons and make a game based solely around them, and it'd still be an enjoyable, tightly designed romp. Another way in which The Lost Age genuinely impressed me was how many different ways it repurposed the same synergy. In one section, you might be using Whirlwind to blow away some leaves, while in another, you're using it to carve paths through sandhills. Then there's the Pound synergy, typically used for smashing pillars into the ground. However, there's a section inside a giant African god statue where you use it to slam floating tiles into an electrical circuit. Yeah, it's weird as fuck, but the levels of creativity when it came to particular synergy were applause-worthy.
Please clap.
There are so many examples of this found throughout the game that I can't even begin to detail them all, but dungeons are packed with shit like this. I feel like I'm skimming over what could be a major focus of the video, but I don't have too much to say. I was just impressed by the sheer scope, and the fact that dungeons of this size can be consistently cohesive and not boring. There are issues with the high random encounter rate and the fact that most dungeons have no story relevance, but when stacked up against their actual design, these things can be forgiven. There are also small caves you can just stumble upon in the world, which contain all sorts of optional goodies. That's one of the benefits of free movement around a somewhat open world, in that you can offer a high reward for unprompted exploration. It's just a shame that the rest of the game suffered as a result. As a final note, I dug the crafting system, even though it's less crafting and more contextual lottery. Throughout your journey, you'll find items which can be refined at a blacksmith and turned into all sorts of randomly appraised gear. This is another decent way of incentivizing exploration, and it works really well in a game that has a much larger focus on equipment than its predecessor. There's a fine line to tread when handing out equipment in an RPG, because if you go too hard, you devalue the rewarding nature of getting new gear. It can also be annoying to constantly switch through a never-ending horde of swords as they're being made redundant every 5 minutes with minute improvements. However, if you're too shallow in the gibs, you isolate a core part of the character progression and effectively ignore what should be a complementary gameplay factor. The original game was a bit shallow with equipment variety, but then it was a much shorter game, so it's not a huge complaint. The focus was also on the djinn system, which offset the need for equipment somewhat, allowing more room for customization without a new weapon upgrade every town. The Lost Age went ham with equipment, but I think it paid off. While I ended up with an inventory full of worthless weapons by the end of the game and discarded most of them to clear up room, the larger concentration made every chest viable. It also didn't have the novelty of the djinn system to fall back on this time. It's a great system, but we've seen it in the previous title, so ramping up the equipment game seemed to be the counterbalance to that. Or maybe I'm just talking complete bullshit, who knows. So to conclude, I sincerely hope Kraden is dead in Dark Dawn. Thanks for watching.